when we talk about money, we should talk about financial capital. Wealth means well-being in a broader concept. And so there are qualitative capitals that go along with that, intellectual capital, human capital. And as we think about financial capital, those things, those resources really need to be in service of the other qualitative capitals, like development of the human, development of intellectual, are we developing knowledge? Are we a learning family? Are we learning together? Are we growing together? Far too many families are underinvested in learning together and experiencing things together. If you look at the investment in in relationships, do families allocate a budget to developing and perpetuating the relationships that they have with each other in creating an experience-rich rising generation? So I think redefining the term wealth to mean well-being, and then using, when we talk about financial capital, that it really needs to be in service of these other capitals: spiritual capital, social capital, intellectual capital, and human capital.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable, quality businesses, while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Dave Specht. He's the director of the Drucker School. I'm going to say that again. Director of the Drucker School Global Family Business Institute. His professional mission is to preserve families and perpetuate businesses. He's the author of Family Business Whisperer and thought leader on topics surrounding generational continuity of businesses and family wealth. Dave, how are you? Nice to see you.
I'm doing good. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Sorry,
Yes.
I probably should have made that easier.
I was counting how many words is that? It's 5 words. I have so many questions about the work you do. I'm fascinated, and I told you that I feel like our worlds meet somewhere because I manage family money, family fortunes, multi-generational wealth, and I invest in stocks, public equity. So at that point, the families I work with have a collection of businesses that they own. And in many cases, these businesses happen to be managed by other families. But you join those families at the point when they are still fully engaged in the original business, and you guide them through the process. And I have 1,000 questions about that. I'm fascinated with that. But before we get started, I like to ask my guests, if you indulge me, about the early days, childhood and upbringing, and how do you think that time shaped you? I'm curious about your relationship with money as well, and how it shaped the career path that you chose.
Yeah, so I grew up in San Diego, California, and my father was a salesman. He sold building maintenance supplies. So he used to joke that he was a toilet paper salesman. But he was really good at what he did. My mom was a bit of an entrepreneur. She was a hairdresser and had her own shop. Um, but I remember the stories that my father told me about his parents, and they were laborers. They were farm workers, and I really, in hearing the story of his mom taking him to the field so that she could work and pick sugar beets, colored how he viewed money and how he viewed work. And interesting enough, he never saw himself as ownership material. He always saw himself as a laborer. And as successful as he was in sales, I asked him one time as a 14-year-old boy, I said, Dad, you make all this money for this business owner. Why don't you just start your own? You do the hardest part. You do the sales. And he just didn't see himself as a business owner. So I think there's some generational perspectives on our relationship with money that get passed down. And I think unless we challenge some of those relationship kind of issues with money, we can't progress. And ultimately, I'm married. I have 6 kids, and I'm trying to teach my kids more of an ownership mentality. It's fine to have a job if that's what they want to do, but for them to, take ownership of their future, and if they want to create something that is their very own, I want to encourage that and model that as well.
How did you discover that ownership idea? Where did it come from? And I'll share with you briefly. I remember as a kid touring some closed down textile mills in Poland where I grew up. And I didn't know that Buffett ended up buying Berkshire, which was a textile mill. And I would ask my parents, who owned it? Who were they? And these were the people that built parks and schools and libraries. And obviously the businesses eventually went away. Innovation, everything changes. But I was fascinated with the stories behind those buildings and behind those families. What happened to them? And I'm curious, where did this idea of no ownership appear in your mind at 14, as you said? Somebody told you? You noticed?
It was modeled by people that were close to me. There were a couple of families that were in our church congregation that were multi-generational family companies, and one of them was a construction company, and they were in their 3rd generation. And what I noticed was that their kids all learned how to work. They were all ambitious because they had to work in the family business, and with that work ethic came a lot of confidence. And I thought, I wonder how I could replicate that. And I don't know if it was true or not, but I connected the dots between the work ethic and the ambitious, attitudes that they had with the fact that their family owned a business. And so from there, I thought, you know what? Ownership is probably the way, not only to secure your own future, to express your creativity, but also a great way to teach your children by modeling owning something and taking full responsibility for developing and creating a product and putting it out into the world. So I think it was modeled, not necessarily by my family, my immediate family, but by people that were close to me.
So the seed was planted, just like a tree. And then it took a little while, and now you were at school, and you're almost done with school from what I know from one of the stories you share. And there was a certain course, a class, that you end up taking. And it sounds like it brought back some of those memories and pointed you in a certain direction. You want to retell the story?
Sure. So I was in graduate school at San Diego State at the time and doing my master's in finance and tax planning. And the only reason I did that program was because I wanted to be able to give advice and not necessarily just be a salesperson. So I wanted to kind of round out my skills. My mother gave me great advice. She said, Dave, people naturally come to you to ask you for advice. You should find an advice profession. And I said, well, what's an advice profession? And financial services happened to be what I chose to do. Mm-hmm. So I was working my way through this program. I needed one elective to graduate. And luckily I happened into a family business management course that was taught by Carmen Bianchi. And, it blended all these technical tax, legal issues with all the non-financial issues that families face of shared ownership, shared decisions, um, and just learning how to be a family together when you have to make decisions around ownership and management. And I was immediately just fascinated. Um, I would never become bored. You know, some of these tax techniques and things like that, I was kind of like not that interested in, but it was the human dynamics that were different for every single family. So it was like a unique puzzle. So I was hooked. I was hooked from that point on. And it took me a while to, navigate because there's not really a clear path to a profession like family business consulting. But I found some great mentors, one being a mutual friend of ours, Jay Hughes. And, thankfully someone invested time with me and I figured out, that you actually could make a living doing this work kind of at the intersection of the financial and non-financial issues that these really amazing families face. And it's been my path ever since.
Jay Hughes, as we spoke earlier, has been a wonderful inspiration and a mentor to me over the years, and I've learned a lot, and I feel like he shaped me in many, many ways. And as you talk about family businesses, I'm thinking of Tony Deaton. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's based in Europe. He invests in family businesses that are publicly traded.
Okay.
And I feel like there is a difference between family businesses and all the other businesses. And I'd love to explore it with you. And Tony specifically values very highly being a partner, a participant in those businesses that happen to be publicly traded. And it's a bigger topic, and we'll come back to it more down the road. But I'm curious about this big picture difference, family businesses and the rest of the business world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are some subtle differences. One is obviously ownership structure. So if you have a family-owned business, even if it's publicly traded, typically the family has a longer-term view than other publicly traded companies or other companies in general. Many times the family's name is connected to that business in a very kind of formal way, which I think naturally leads you to want to make better decisions because it's reflective on your family. I think sometimes in public companies you have CEOs that are brought in for very specific purposes, and they're looking to improve stock prices from quarter to quarter. And, family businesses have an opportunity to, manage quarter century to quarter century if that's what they choose to do rather than quarter to quarter. And it just changes the decision-making process. I think family businesses can, innovate and pivot faster than publicly traded companies because there's fewer layers of bureaucracy. I don't think the media tells that story. I think family businesses get a reputation for maybe not being sophisticated or not being innovative, but couldn't be farther from the truth.
There's more at stake. That's how I look at it, because you said the name and the family wealth, financially speaking as well, and the reputation and so on. And you can take a long-term view. You're not trying to make a short-term shareholder happy. And we'll come back to it, I'm sure, throughout this conversation. But these days you see CEOs that get hired really for a few years, and they can't really take long-term decisions because they won't be even around to see the consequences of it. And when I think of a family business, there's this idea of planting trees for others to enjoy that you and I, I'm sure, are familiar with. And a family can do it because they're doing something that will bring benefits 10, 20, 30 years from now, the decisions that are made today. And they're benefiting from the decisions that were made 20, 40 years ago. So there's this continuity.
Yeah, this healthy combination of like gratitude for the past, but then a stewardship kind of mentality rather than, get what I can get, for the short term, next 3 to 5 years as a CEO. So it just changes the mentality. It changes the decision process. I also think they have a different relationship with employees. They have an opportunity to create a culture that is maybe more of a family-like culture, a culture that takes care of. And I think many of these business owners view their employees as an extension of their family, because those employees have helped their family to have what they have. And so there oftentimes is this great connectivity and loyalty between non-family employees and the family ownership group, which is a beautiful thing.
The employees feel more invested in the success of the business than an employee of a company that could be cut next month with the other 1,000 or 10,000 that are let go. So there's,
I believe that's correct. Yeah,
there's a lesson there. You talked about advice, and I'm thinking of, giving the answers, and having 20 years of experience managing money for families. I realized that sometimes, and it rhymes with what you talk about, is the question, not the answer, that matters. And you talk about the inspired questions. Can you talk about these? What are they?
Sure. Well, I learned this from a hard experience, Bogomil. I had finished my graduate degree and started doing some advising of families. And I was so excited about these new techniques that I had learned in school that I was telling, and I was showing them, and I was telling them what they should do. And guess what? I wasn't having much success. They weren't listening to me. And so I went back to the drawing board on, well, first of all, I need to back up. So early on, I had just gotten married. I was still in school, and I had my first child, and I was sitting in this basement apartment holding this little girl in my arms. And every time I would come home and hold her, I would look into her face, and I would be filled with anxiety. I was young, and I didn't know that I had all the answers that she was going to need for her life. And I thought, oh no, did I make a mistake to have a child so young? And I sat with this for a while, and finally I confided in a university professor, and he gave me some advice. He said, Dave, don't worry about having all the right answers for her. Make sure you have all the right questions. And I thought, I don't even know what that means. But pondering it over the years, it meant, when she's 3 years old, what are you going to ask her so that she'll tell you about her day and what she's learning? When she's 10 years old, what questions are you going to ask so that she'll allow you into her life? That little girl is, 21 years old now. What questions am I going to ask her today so she'll allow me to be a part of her life? So she doesn't care about me giving her the answers. She wants me to be curious about her life. And so then I translated that into my professional life. And I thought, you know what? If my kids don't care about me having all the answers, then my clients probably don't either. Maybe they need me to ask them better questions. And so it sent me down a path of kind of developing, a framework for what I call inspired questions. And really, there's a few things. One, I try to not have too many yes-no questions. You don't learn a lot from a yes-no question. I like to ask questions that don't have the right or wrong answer. They just lead to expression and invite sharing. And, one of my favorites, can I share with you one of my favorite questions?
Tell me.
And I'll ask this to you, and I'll turn the tables on you. The question is, what does it mean to be a Baranowski?
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty introspective question. You have to be careful asking this one because people will immediately get quiet. They'll go inside their head and in their heart. But when they emerge, something beautiful comes out, and they'll tell you usually what they really think about their last name and what it means to be a member of that family.
Well, you're going to get a lot of silence here, but I'll tell you what popped in my head when you asked the question. And it gave me chills when you asked that question because I didn't know I'm on the spot here, but I'll play along. I thought of a tree, and I told that story once or twice before. There's a tree that my great-grandfather planted in a park when he was 17, over 100 years ago. And it was the end of World War I. Poland was about to regain independence, and a group of kids from local high school, he was part of it, planted a couple of oak trees. And that tree is still there. And my grandparents walked under that tree. My dad learned to ride a bicycle in the park under that tree. And I walked up under that tree many, many times, including with my fiancée and my wife. She knows about that tree. So I feel like that's a physical continuity in my family that I can walk up to and touch. And that's I can say, my great-grandfather stood under that little tree and planted it, and it's still here. And it's very powerful to me to think of it, because that's how I feel. Family wealth is that kind of expression, or a family business, that kind of expression that you can actually almost touch it. And as you said, the decisions that were made decades ago or generations ago, you see the results, and you know the decisions you make today for the family, with the family, will have consequences generations to come. So that's
beautiful. That's beautiful. The whole act of planting seeds. I mean, we're planting so many different seeds in our life, and others will benefit from them, or some of those seeds are not so good seeds, and so those may be challenges that our children or our grandchildren inherit as well. And so I think there's an opportunity to look at some of those things and make modifications in our life as well.
You said something that made me think of other guest that I had on the show. His name is Dan Solon. He was a lawyer, then an investment advisor, wrote a number of books, but one of the recent books is called Ask, and I'll be very brief about it. But he points out what you talk about, that it's not about the answer, it's about asking questions. And it's not about asking yes or no. He actually emphasizes the importance of asking follow-up questions. Mm-hmm. We're so used to asking the first question, and we forget about the follow-up questions, and they can reveal more and more and more. And a beautiful book and a fun episode that I had with him, and Dan Solon. I'll share the name with you after that. But I think it rhymes with the way you think about asking questions and the way I grew to appreciate the power of questions, instead of going into a room and saying, I know exactly what you need. I honestly don't, but I can give my attention and presence and everything else to this conversation, so that you and I can identify what some of the possible answers are.
Well, our questions are an indicator of our curiosity and how much we care.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about, and you've asked me some great questions, and so I know that you care about this conversation.
I do.
And when we're interacting with our clients, they will know, like, do we really care, or are we about a transaction that we're trying to bring to them? And so, I highly recommend to any advisors that listen to this, spend more time on your questions in your meeting preparation with clients than you do on your presentation, and see what happens.
Well, in the spirit of asking questions, I have a big one for you. And let me phrase it this way. As I'm listening to you, you've met so many families and you've seen so many businesses. And I'm thinking, is there a secret to success? Is there a principle or a handful of principles that you've seen that allow families to keep the business, see it thrive, and most of all, keep the family engaged in that business over generations?
Part of the secret is not having too many secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the secret is being more transparent. And depending on what culture, is listening to this, from what culture you're in, there's varied levels of transparency that are expected in that culture. But for me, it's really difficult for the rising generation to know what is expected of them if they don't really understand what the business is, how they're going to inherit it, how they're supposed to manage it, things they're supposed to learn to prepare to take on, whether active leadership or just an ownership role with no active management. And so I would say transparency and communication is definitely one. The second is continued innovation. Peter Drucker talked about systematic abandonment. When he was doing any strategy work with a CEO, that was something that had to be on the agenda. And what that means is, what are we going to stop doing? We have to be as intentional with looking to stop doing things so that we can make space for innovation and new. And I think that's a key. One family I work with, in the first generation, it was an aviation sales company, very successful. And why were they successful? Because the founder was great at sales. The founder suddenly passed away, and his son was thrust into leadership, and his son was not good at sales. And he took the chance to completely reinvent the business and turn it into an aviation maintenance company, because that was something that he was better at, and that was something that was an organization he could lead. They're now the largest aviation maintenance company in the world. So continued innovation and continued looking at, what can you stop doing so that you can make space for what else is new. The other thing is, and Dennis Jaffe taught me this, is all these families that make it past 100 years, they have one thing in common, and that is that they have a path to liquidity for shareholders. So that means that any shareholder that stays an owner means they are an owner by choice, not by force. And that's a beautiful thing to think about, because when you have owners that know that there is a path to liquidity, but they choose to stay owning that asset, you know that they're aligned with the leadership and with the management of that company and the general trajectory of the business. So I think those are a few things that are key to longevity.
It's a unique way of looking at shareholders and thinking of the family members. And I know there are families in Europe where you have a company, I'm not going to mention any names, but that have 1,000 shareholders now, and they're all related. And thinking of that they do have an option to leave. And it's a very powerful concept, because it means that those that stay, they do want to stay, right? It's such a seemingly small but powerful idea that the door is open.
There's far too few families that are formalizing those things and communicating about them and re-communicating that there is a path to liquidity, and this is how shares get valued. And every year there is an opportunity, so that if a shareholder, one day raises their hand and say, I'd rather have liquidity than be an owner, that they know that they're not going to be made to feel guilty, that they know that maybe there is a limit on how much they can sell each year, but there's a path. And it really is what opens up 100-year type continuity opportunities.
Dave, when I come across a business that a family has owned for a few generations, I often wonder about the source of longevity. Is it the family? Is it the business itself? Is it the industry? Maybe it's all three. How do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a few sources. One is there's a purpose, and usually there's a shared purpose. Typically, a founder has a vision for what they want to create, and a rising generation maybe buys into that purpose, or maybe the purpose of the business shifts over time. But there needs to be a purpose that's bigger than just making money. Second, it needs to be profitable. Where there's purpose and there's profits, there's possibility. And again, the third one is back to our last statement, this path to liquidity. So I think longevity comes from a family having a purpose that's bigger than just making money. The business needs to be profitable, and then there needs to be a path to liquidity for shareholders. So I think those are three things that really lead to, the opportunity to have longevity in a family company.
You mentioned profits, and it made me think of the fact that I read it somewhere in a book, how 100 years ago, 150 years ago, I think the story was about the UK, when people talked about each other as rich, they didn't talk about being asset rich. I have a net worth of this much. They thought of themselves how much income from the businesses they have they can collect each year. And I know that thinking is very much alive in many places. It's maybe not in the headlines these days, but there are families around the whole world, many of them that I have met, that think in terms of the income that they collect as an individual or as a family each year from the business or businesses that they own. And you touched on it, and I find it fascinating, because I think a lot of the families you talk about, and correct me if I'm wrong, they don't know really their net worth.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, how assets get valued. And as you and I both know, assets get valued differently depending on what purpose the valuation is taking place for. So
are you a buyer or a seller?
Yeah. Or if you're trying to perpetuate a business or assets from one generation to the next, right, likely the value of those assets will be suppressed as much as possible so that they can be efficient as possible in passing the business from one generation to the next. I do think the concept of looking at cash flow versus looking at net worth is really important. Here in the United States, I've worked with a number of very large cattle operations, very old ranches. Well, guess what? Many of them don't cash flow very well. And so, a lot of them expect the pride of ownership, of just knowing that you have a piece of ownership in a family ranch that's been in the family for 130 years is enough for someone to want to continue to own it. Well, maybe, but unless there's cash flow, unless there's some sort of liquidity, you're going to have a hard time keeping those family members engaged. And one of the keys, if there's not great cash flow, is, those owners need to do a great job of helping the shareholders to continue to emotionally own the asset. Because unless there is that emotional connection, they're going to look at it and compare it to a regular publicly traded stock and figure out that maybe they could do better elsewhere, or maybe they could, receive more cash flow if they were invested in a different way or in a different asset. So I think it's healthy to look at it in both ways. But ultimately, if business owners don't look at it from a cash flow perspective, especially if they have shareholders that, have cash flow needs or cash flow expectations, those are the businesses that get sold.
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at that. Where is the wealth? Is it in an income-producing asset? How much income it produces? Is it worth holding on to? And the story behind it. And the example that you gave, it's true that the assets underneath could be repurposed and probably used for home development and so on. And you could become asset rich, realize that very quickly instead of waiting for the cash flow. Dave, I have a big picture question, something that I interact with daily, being a public equity investor. And I see this phenomenon of a shrinking attention span, accelerated turnover in CEOs, especially in the public markets, and growing importance of passive investing, which in my mind is almost anonymous ownership. I'll tell you a story later, but I had the experience where basically a company I owned, there was no major shareholder, and the CEO ended up calling me about something. I was very surprised because I was a minority shareholder, but I happened to be in the top 10 at some point of shareholders because there was nobody else. The rest were funds, ETFs. So there is a lack of a major shareholder. When you have a business owned by a family, this might be the only kind of business that can take a true long-term view and provide longevity and continuity for the business, the capital invested, the employees, and all the stakeholders. Am I onto something?
You definitely are. And I think what we're going to see is more funds developed that are designed to invest in family-owned companies, to basically take a minority share in a family-owned company, become the liquidity provider for a family so that they can buy out family members that are either no longer interested in the business or aren't creating any unique value. Family offices all the time now are, I'm talking to them about, family-owned companies. And there is this kind of interesting need that the families have to create liquidity for shareholders, but not want to go down the road of private equity and ultimately on a path to sell. They want to keep the business. And so I think there is a unique opportunity from an investment perspective for investors to get involved with owning parts and pieces of really healthy family-owned businesses that have great governance structures in place and that are built to be managed quarter century to quarter century.
You brought up private equity, and the term means so many different things to different people. I think these days it means something else. I don't think it was even labeled this way 50 years ago. And I'm thinking of Buffett and Munger buying, basically being that option for families.
Yeah.
Continue to run it.
Permanent capital, I like to call it.
Permanent capital.
Yeah.
And there are other people that do that, but it's very different than what private equity means to most people, which is you buy an asset for a period of time. The fund has an expiration date by definition. You use leverage. You take some steps to show immediate results that might be undercutting the performance of the business. And in the public market, I sometimes see those companies relisted again. I get to see the damage that's been done, speaking very openly, to the business, to the brand, to the relationship with the customer and suppliers and so on. So this is not the way to go. But what you describe is basically a Buffett-like permanent capital that takes the place of the family or a portion of it and allows the same kind of continuity.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you one example. A family office was in their seventh generation. In the fifth generation, they sold their operating company. They had this great pool of cash, invested in lots of real estate, but then, they understand family-owned businesses, and they have friends that owned family-owned businesses, and they had the same needs. They had liquidity needs. They had shareholders that would rather have cash than continue to own the business, and so they started collecting family-owned businesses as a part of their portfolio, and the real challenge that family offices have now is, you may if you're in your sixth generation, you may have 100 shareholders or more, and how do you keep up with the cash flow demands that 100 shareholders, and then moving to the next generation where it could be 300 shareholders? How do you keep up with the cash flow demands that they have? And the key is buying businesses that are creating great cash flow. And many of these types of family office investors are solving that by buying family-owned companies that are cash flowing really, really well.
So I've heard that story many times from many families that transitioned from the original business to a collection of businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard also the version that you presented where they are so familiar with family-operated businesses that they're comfortable holding a handful of family-owned businesses. And that story rhymes around the whole globe. So
yeah,
it's fascinating. When you see something repeated around the globe, you start to think they're onto something. They found something that works for them and their approach. Or eventually, like the families I've worked with, that they turn to the public markets and have a collection of businesses, but they also think of them as long-term ownership. It's fascinating how that evolves. It's a transition. Do you have some thoughts about that transition? It comes up in quite a few conversations on this show, how a family had one business that created the wealth. Somebody took risks. And then there's this moment that it's better for the family and the business to part ways, in the sense that there will be a new owner for the entire business. And we're looking at the financial capital that will be allocated going forward into a collection of businesses. Do you have some thoughts about that transition? I know it's a very emotional decision as well as it is, a financial decision and a business decision.
It is a difficult transition because someone that is an operator of a business is not necessarily comfortable with handing over decision control to others and being a passive investor in other people's deals, So that for them specifically, it's a really difficult transition. I'll give you a story, though. I was working with a family on the West Coast. They were a large farming operation, and I was working with the grandmother. Grandfather has passed away. They had this beautiful farm, and it was large. She had a nephew that said he wanted to run the farm, and she was giving him an opportunity to do so, and he was kind of in his trial period. And I was brought in to figure out, how to make sure this nephew could communicate with his grandmother and the other shareholders to see if he could actually manage the farm. Well, what we ended up discovering was it was actually going to be better for the family and better for that farm if they sold the farm, because the nephew was not really prepared, not really competent enough to, he could manage the farm, but he wasn't good enough from a relationship perspective to communicate and to understand and to take the time to nurture the relationships with the other family shareholders. Turns out the family sold the farm for $25 million. It created all kinds of liquidity where there was none before. And that ended up being a good thing. The farm is well managed now. The family, doesn't have to be in shared decisions with regards to a farming operation. And so that was the decision that they made. That wasn't what they went into the project seeking, but that's what they found out, that it would actually be better for their family relationships if they didn't have this farming operation as a shared ownership piece or as a shared management piece. So those transitions are really tough, though, because many of them feel like they're losing part of their identity when they sell that business. I think specifically with agriculture, when they live on the farm, when they live on the ranch, there's a heritage there, and they feel guilty for selling something that their parents or grandparents developed. So it is very emotional. And then the relationship with the money becomes really interesting because they're not sure what they should do with it, how they should treat it, because it still represents what their parents and grandparents helped to develop. And there's oftentimes a lot of guilt connected with that newly found pot of cash. It's fraught with really a lot of challenges.
It requires a lot of empathy and understanding to embrace what's happening.
And I feel like there's an empathy crisis amongst advisors. I really feel like, I don't know how we teach it, but there is quite a bit, there is a lack of empathy for a founder that has sold their business, has this great pool of money. Many advisors don't have a lot of empathy. They make jokes like, "Oh yeah, I'd like to try on your problems for a day," or things like that. And somehow we need to change that, because these are families that have real emotions connected to the businesses that they ran, and now this newfound wealth and their relationship with the wealth. So I don't know if you've figured out how to add empathy to an advising relationship, but it's something that we need to figure out.
I'd love to think that we can teach it. I'd like to think that a lot of us just have it. I grew up in a household with 2 physicians, 2 doctors, and it was the last 10 years of communist Poland when I was growing up. So they didn't do it for the money. They were actually less paid than the electrician that worked at the hospital because of the country regime. So they were doing it because they loved it. And I remember my dad pulling over on the road and helping out when an accident happened. So it was a job that never ended. And it never started, it just kept going. And I would go to the hospital, bring sandwiches to see my dad when he was doing night shifts at the hospital. So I grew up with this idea of serving others and providing value. And I see my work as such. And it's something that I'm passionate about. I care about the people whose money I manage. And I'm not doing it for the money. I mean, it's a rewarding pursuit, but that's not the goal in itself. I extend myself to my limits and make myself available, not thinking that what will come in return, not in terms of billable hours. I don't even charge that way, right? So to me, that's the only way to go about it, like my parents were treating their patients.
I think you further extended the question we asked earlier, what does it mean to be a Baranowski? So add that component to your seed and tree story. That's beautiful.
Thank you. Well, you helped me discover some aspects of who I am and how I see the calling that I found, and I love what I do. And I don't know, it just makes my day if I can help somebody in some way. And sometimes it's just a turn of phrase, a question that I ask, or some space that we can create for some conversations that have to be had.
Beautiful.
I wrote down a note to myself. It's not really a question, just an observation. As I was listening to you and preparing for this call as well, it came together. I was thinking of preserving the family and perpetuating the business. And what you're trying to do is to see both of them happen. And sometimes, from what you just mentioned, you might have to make a choice. For the family to continue, they might have to part with the business, especially if you want that business to continue, right? Like the farm that you talked about. So I think it's a fascinating revelation where one cannot come at the expense of the other. And sometimes the two have to part ways for the two to go on. I think it's a hard realization for some families, but I think that's what I'm hearing, that there might be a moment where you might have to hand over the keys to somebody else. And
I would just say, I mean, if every family approached transition planning with the preservation of the family relationships as the first order of business, and the second being the perpetuation of the business, I actually think that's the healthiest way to go about it. Because it's actually easier to rebuild a business than it is to rebuild family relationships. And you can have both, but at some point there are decisions that need to be made that maybe it doesn't make sense for us to all own this together. Maybe it does make sense for some of us to exit if we have other interests. And if it's stated that the purpose of us doing this planning is to preserve our relationships and to create clarity and a roadmap forward, not only for the business, but for us as a family unit. I think those are beautiful. That's a beautiful way to look at it. And it takes us away from, being lured into the technical aspects of just tax planning or just doing what makes sense from a legal perspective to perpetuate a business. I mean, the plans that we put in place need to be humanized, and they need to be for the people and not just for the business. And so that's why I say that preservation of family is first, and the perpetuation of the business is a close second, but I think it does need to be second.
Well, channeling our mutual friend Jay Hughes, I have to bring up the topic of well-being. He reminds us every time that the financial capital is not the only capital. And in your writing, you bring up this question, what does it mean to be wealthy? I'm curious how you think about it, and you explain how wealth goes beyond the financial capital. It's the values, it's the well-being. Can you introduce the audience to this broader way of looking at wealth?
Sure. So, even using the term, I would love to join Jay in us changing how the word wealth is used. When we talk about money, we should talk about financial capital. Wealth means well-being in a broader concept, and so there are qualitative capitals that go along with that. Intellectual capital, human capital, and as we think about financial capital, those things, those resources, really need to be in service of the other qualitative capitals, like development of the human, development of intellectual. Are we developing knowledge? Are we a learning family? Are we learning together? Are we growing together? Far too many families are underinvested in learning together and experiencing things together. You think about what a family invests to manage real estate. That's a real cost. But if you look at the investment in in relationships, do families allocate a budget to developing and perpetuating the relationships that they have with each other in creating an experience-rich rising generation? So I think redefining the term wealth to mean well-being, and then using, when we talk about financial capital, that it really needs to be in service of these other capitals: spiritual capital, social capital, intellectual capital, and human capital.
Oh, that's beautifully put, and I love this broad definition of wealth and well-being, and remembering that financial capital is just one of the building blocks, but not the building block.
Well, and financial capital doesn't, however much we accumulate, it will not fulfill us. It's only the other qualitative capitals that will lead to fulfillment and lead to a meaningful, rich life. I have a friend that sold his business a year and a half ago for 9 figures. And he said that the 6 weeks after he sold that business were maybe the darkest 6 weeks of his life, because he lost some of his identity, and he thought that when he sold the business that it would be a mountaintop experience for him and that he would be celebrated, and it was none of that for him. It was, now who am I? I'm 39 years old, and I don't have the employees. I don't have this team that has a mission and a purpose to accomplish something. Yes, I'm now financially wealthy, but where am I? And it just drove home to me the fact that, we focus way too much on financial capital as a means of providing satisfaction, when, we need to give those other capitals as much attention and make sure the financial capital is essentially magnifying those others and building them up.
Beautifully put. I love that topic. I want to ask you about one more aspect that I found really fascinating. You talk about the role of spouses in inheriting a family business. And I wrote an article years ago, one of the first articles that I published, about the role of women throughout history in actually maintaining and keeping alive the businesses throughout history. And women's roles actually have not been properly represented in history books, but they happened, and they were part of many European families, but not only, around the world and in the US as well. So I find it fascinating when you brought it up, the surviving spouse and their role. And many of the clients I've worked with, they happen to be the surviving spouses of the clients, the original clients that I knew in many cases. So I do have that experience, and I find it really interesting what happens the day after and what continues. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, family businesses come in all shapes and sizes and forms. So it could be that a husband and wife team build the business together. But many times, I'm working with a husband that's built the business, and the spouse has been more focused on investing her time in keeping the family together and having some normalcy to life while her partner, builds a business. And when I think of these spouses, I mean, they are the unsung heroes of the whole situation. Many times they're the confidant, they're the counselor, they're the champion of, keep going, I believe in you, we can do this, I'll make do with whatever you're able to bring home. And especially in those really lean years, I mean, the spouses are the ones that are keeping it all together. When I think about, how decisions get made, if you're not including a non-operating spouse in a decision about estate planning or what should happen with the business, as an advisor, you're making a horrible mistake, because they're the ones that have the seat at the intersection between the family and the business. They know the dynamics between their children, and they are the storytellers. They're the story keepers. They are either ambassadors for the family business, or they are speaking poorly about the family business, and that will influence their children's view on joining the family business, how they feel about it. Do they compete with the family business because the family business gets more attention than they do? So when I think of these spouses, I mean, they play such a huge role in not only the perpetuation of the business, but also, keeping the relationships with their children, really preparing the rising generation to have a relationship with money. They're the ones that color it. Typically, they're the ones that prepare the rising generation for all those things. And so one of the things we're doing is I'm doing a project called the Better Half Project, where we're studying the experience of these spouses from entrepreneurial families. And what we're finding is that oftentimes their identity is swallowed up in the shadow of a founder and in the shadow of a business. And many times they face these transitions in their life where maybe they are focusing on the children for a while there, and when they're launched, they have their own transitions. And who's helping them? There's far too few programs and far too little focus on the unique roles that they play and the unique power that they have to affect change, not only within the family, but within the business too. Really fascinating group.
It is a fascinating topic. And I have a handful of more questions for you, but I feel like this topic alone could have been the topic of a separate episode, but I love that we included it. You brought up children. So before I ask you one of the last questions, I do want to ask you about children, and especially raising children amid wealth. And I heard you recommend the 3 Gs. Mm-hmm. I know what they are, but for the benefit of the audience, what are they?
Yeah. So the 3 Gs are gratitude, goals, and grit. I like to say that gratitude and entitlement are incompatible roommates, so they can't live together. And entitlement doesn't begin with the rising generation. Entitlement begins with me. It begins with the choices that I'm making. If I feel like my kids are entitled, it's because I have made choices that have made them entitled. And so I think there's a power for us to think about, how do we amplify gratitude to be able to push out that entitlement. So that's one. Gratitude is the key to happiness, honestly, in life. Because if we're grateful, if we're actively looking for the things that are good, we'll see them. And if we're not, we'll see those things too. So that's gratitude is one. Goals is the second one. And that's really, we all need an aim. We all need something to pursue. It doesn't necessarily have to be money. If you raise in a family that, more money isn't necessarily the answer, just ambitiously pursue something. Where I've seen the most suffering is where there isn't an ambitious pursuit, where there aren't goals, where there isn't a pursuit, and where there is just consumption. That's a recipe for real misery. And so, for families that have great financial capital, figuring out how to invest in the rising generation so that they have ambitious pursuits, so that they find what their interests are, and that we invest in and encourage them to chase those things down, I think is really important. And then the third one is grit. Basically, that's resilience. Allowing our kids to fall down and then to get back up and to celebrate their efforts, not necessarily celebrate their successes only. And when you think about great successes that have happened in family-owned companies, it's typically because of a lot of grit and resilience. So those are my 3 G's.
I love it. I love the sound of it. Dave, what's your definition of success?
Well, it changes depending on where you are in your life.
Mm-hmm.
For me right now, success is when my child who's grown wants to call me on the phone, when they're choosing to be in relationship with me. That means something went right. When my relationship with my wife is good, when I'm serving her, when my focus is on her happiness, that's success. Success is living with a clear conscience. Success for me is pursuing things I believe in. Success is being in relationship with people that lift me up and that I can lift up. And so success is a conversation with you, Bogomil.
It definitely felt that way to me. I'm so grateful we connected. And I wrote to myself listening to you, and it's a compliment to you, that the families that work with you, they basically cannot afford not to have you in their life. That's what I wrote down to myself. And
Very
I don't
kind.
know if that's how you think about it, but that's what I felt listening to you, that they might not know that somebody like you exists, but you do. And I think the minute they discover that you do exist, they have this realization they can't afford to wait any longer, and they have to have you in their life. So on that note,
very kind.
Thank you so much for today. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogomil Baranowski.